Oogenesis is going to be the production of female gametes, which basically means this is the opposite aspect of spermatogenesis. In the male system, spermatogenesis produces sperm. In the female system, oogenesis produces oocytes or eggs. Now, this all begins, very interestingly though, in the fetal period. So when a female is still in utero, so still in the uterus of her mother, so she hasn't been born yet, that's when this process initiates. So even before birth, the oogonia are starting to go through and produce these oocytes. You'll have these primary oocytes develop into primordial follicles. That's that starting point. Then those primary oocytes begin meiosis but stall at prophase 1. So we stall right at the beginning. So these are not mature eggs. These are just the very beginning stages. But it all happens before she's even born. So this aspect is all in utero, basically in the fetal system. Now, after puberty, so pretty much everything just sits until puberty. Once puberty occurs, then a few primary oocytes are activated each month. Of those few primary oocytes, one is selected each month to go through and resume meiosis 1. Now, I say one because that's the typical. There is the potentiality for 2 or potentially 3 to be activated to resume meiosis 1. Now, if 2 are activated and both become fertilized, you're looking at twins, fraternal twins. But vast majority of times, it's one single oocyte goes back into meiosis 1. So when you go through meiosis 1, we end up with 2 cells. We have the secondary oocyte, but then we have the first polar body. And I say first because we'll end up with 3 polar bodies in total. So we have the secondary oocyte and first polar body. Now that secondary oocyte is going to arrest or stop at metaphase 2. So it doesn't finish meiosis. But at this point, it's in metaphase 2, and it's now waiting for ovulation. Once ovulated, obviously it goes into the uterine tube, and if it's penetrated by a sperm cell, then it'll complete meiosis 2. If a sperm cell never penetrates the actual arrested or paused meiosis, you never finish meiosis. But if that sperm cell penetrates the oocyte, then now we'll finish meiosis 2, which yields the ovum, which is the egg. This is now the fully set mature egg, and another polar body. You're saying, well, hold on, that's 2. Where's the other one? Get back to that in a second. We will get to 3. So we've gone through pausing in fetal all the way up until puberty or after. Then a few are selected each time. And then if fertilization occurs, you complete the meiosis process. So here's what it looks like broken down in the different phases. And now this one, I'm going to throw up full screen, just make it a little easier to see. Before birth, this is all in fetal. You have the initial meiotic events, oogonium making the primary oocyte. That's your primordial follicle. Then infancy through childhood, it just stays there. Still the same primordial follicle. Nothing happens. Nothing happens until you reach puberty and after. Then each month after puberty until menopause, there'll be a couple cells that will be picked, and eventually you'll have a primary follicle. You'll go into the secondary follicle. It'll end up pausing there, and then you'll complete, and then wait for, okay, no, it's time now for ovulation. Vesicular follicle. We've still on pause now. Then notice, right here, at this point, you have one polar body and a secondary oocyte. But then if that sperm comes in, then you end up with the second polar body and the ovum. But notice what happened. That first polar body went down and formed 2 more polar bodies. It's still divided. It's not functional, it's not doing anything, but but still divided. So in total, we still have one cell becoming a total of 4 haploid cells. So one cell that was diploid becomes 4 haploid cells at this point. And that's the idea of oogenesis. It has different pause points depending on what's going on. But the end result, if fertilization occurred, is the same. 1 became 4. But only 1 is active, that ovum. The other 3 are simply polar bodies to be discarded. So where do they go? The body simply breaks them down and reabsorbs the material. So that's the idea of oogenesis. Now, that oogenesis is controlled by the ovarian cycle because you can't mature these oocytes without hormonal control. So the hormonal control in this monthly cycle from puberty until menopause, unless drugs stop it, is going to be 2 consecutive cycles within, or just kind of phases within a 20-day period. So broken up pretty much into first 14 days and second 14 days. You have the follicular phase. That's day 1 through day 14. That is when you have the growth of the follicle occurring. So the follicle is growing and maturing. Then you have the ovulation occurring. That's mid-cycle. That's right around day 14 there. Now, obviously, everyone's a little bit different. Each system might have a little different variation occurring here. Then you go into luteal phase. Luteal phase is after ovulation, which means the oocyte's gone. We're looking at the corpus luteum being formed and being active now. And this is days 14 through 28, roughly. Because while it's being put down as a 28-day cycle, that's the average across everyone. There might be 27 or 26-day cycles, or 29 or 30-day cycle. Each person's body is unique. This is just the normal average that kind of works through. So again, looking at the different phases, and this is giving a histological view. The primordial follicles, each one of these is a primordial follicle. We're looking at the very basic ones are waiting and ready to go. Primary follicles, look at the thickness around the oocyte. It's increased in thickness a little bit, cuboidal to columnar. Secondary follicle, we now have at least 2 layers around it. It could be more. By the time you get the late secondary follicle, that fluid-filled antrum is starting. It's not very large yet, but that antrum will grow. Now we have the vesicular follicle. You can see the larger antrum present. There's more fluid-filled space there. And this is just before ovulation. Here we have ovulation, and now that oocyte is being ovulated into the actual fimbriae of the uterine tube. So what happens is that wall of the ovary ruptures, allowing the oocyte to leave, and it's surrounded by its corona radiata. That's just a little bit of tissue that's left around the oocyte as it's ovulated. Now that moves off and leaves behind the rest of the tissue. Now when that occurs, they have a term called Milchschmerz. That's the idea of there's a little twinge of pain right at the moment of ovulation. Because technically, ovulation is a small rupture being formed in the ovary. Now, they're saying some people feel that, some people don't. Honestly, I have no idea. So it comes down to personal preference and what you're feeling at that exact moment. 1% to 2% of ovulations, though, can have something happen that's a little unique. Can have more than 1 secondary oocyte. So if those 2, 3, 4, however many get fertilized, that's fraternal twins. They're not looking identical because it's 2 separate sets of genetic information. But that's again only if both or all 3, for example, were able to get fertilized by different sperm cells. Then we have luteal phase. This is the second half of the process. So days 15 on through 28 roughly. In luteal phase, the ruptured follicle is collapsing back on itself, creating the corpus luteum. Now the corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone and estrogen for that next 2-week cycle roughly. That's if no fertilization occurs. It's 2 weeks. Because it's helping to control the hormonal levels over this luteal phase. So that lasts about 10 days, give or take. Might be up to 12 days there. But that's how much the hormone and how much the corpus luteum is lasting for. But if pregnancy occurs, so if fertilization occurs and you have then the implantation of the sperm and egg together into the uterine lining, then this can last up to about 3 months producing hormones, progesterone, estrogen. It's doing this and it'll last this long because waiting for the placenta. Once the placenta is formed and functional, the corpus luteum is done. Placenta will take over hormone production. And that happens, give or take, around a 3-month period. So at that point, the corpus luteum degrades to a corpus albicans. But if there was no fertilization, so back up top here, this 10-day thing, then about 10 to 12 days in there, that will then form the corpus albicans. So it really depends on what is occurring, fertilization or no fertilization. Now we're looking at here, this tissue is going to be the corpus luteum. That's what's left over after ovulation occurred. So looking at some of the different phases of the ovarian cycle, from the first 14 days to the second 14 days, follicular to luteal phases.